Welcome back to another episode of Words That Kill. And today's guest is author Christopher Russell, and we're here to talk about the noble sacrifice death. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself. So take it away.
Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Russell. You probably know me better as the author of the Divinity's Twilight series. It's sort of an epic fantasy crossed with a sci-fantasy that follows a group of cadets as they deal with an ancient threat from the past that's been resurrected and brought into the present. A lot of combination of technology and magic, airships, a bunch of different stuff, 7 different races. I always like to call it a cross between Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. And so book 2 just released last September. Whole series is doing very well. You can find all of that stuff on Amazon and also at my website, ChristopherRussellAuthor.com.
How do you go about picking the victim for a noble sacrifice? Do you choose the protagonist or do you generally go with the secondary character?
I have not killed a protagonist yet, so that's a little bit of spoilers for my series. Mostly they've been secondary characters, but they've been part of what I would consider my main cast. They're people that have had POV. I find that it's most important that it's somebody that's completed their character arc, or that the sacrifice is what completes their character arc. And so, what I mean by that, and I'm going to use a popular example because it's unlikely to spoil things for people. If you look at Game of Thrones, you come to the end of season 1, you come to the end of book 1, and Ned Stark gets executed. And so it's a culmination of his journey because he's chosen the honorable path that he is going to figure out what the rod is at the center of the Baratheon slash Lannister dynasty, and that he's going to pull it into the light, that he's going to expose them to the public. And of course, he does this in a very straightforward way. He believes that the law is on his side and he forgets what universe he's in. It's a very callous, uncaring universe. And ultimately, the powers that be don't care that he's on the side of truth, that he's on the side of justice, and he ends up getting executed anyway. But that is a completion of his character arc, that he was noble right up into the end, that he tried to save his family, that he sends his daughter Arya away. But it's also an introduction to George R. R. Martin's world, that you can be the principal main character for the entire novel and still die anyway. And so there's a bunch of different things that you can do. So talking about a few of mine, I won't go into spoilers, but I have a character that is best friends with my lead, and that he is sort of saved by the lead. He has a terrible home environment, and he gets away from that because the lead drags him. He's supposed to go to this prestigious school, and the lead encounters him there, takes him out, um, gets him drunk. They have a wild night, and he ends up enrolled at a school that he never thought he was going to go to. But this is how he breaks free of his father's influence, how he gets away from his abusive brothers. That this is the way that he actually gets to live life. And so he goes through and has all these great experiences. At the very end, he decides, well, I'm going to give the life that I've been given back, that I'm going to save my best friend, even if it means my death. And he doesn't know 100% that he's going to die, but he goes into this believing that it's my turn to return the favor. It's my turn to give back the life that I was given.
Okay, so when you're crafting the character death and you're having someone literally sacrifice themselves for the greater good or for someone else or whatever the reason, how do you do it without seeming cliche?
There's 3 different ways you can go about this. You can either foreshadow it heavily, that there's subtext, there's context clues, that you've had them putting their affairs in order, things like that. You can have it be abrupt and sudden, or you can have some sort of a mix between the two. The one I was just discovered was very abrupt. That I wanted people to understand that the main characters aren't necessarily protected, similar to that George R. R. Martin style. And so there wasn't a lot of cliche. There wasn't a lot of run up to this actually occurring. And so it was more of a twist than something that had been foreshadowed. But as far as cliches go, you're probably talking about well, he just bought a farm, or that this was his final mission, things like that. And I would say that the way that you avoid those cliches is that it comes back to characterization, that you are building the character up in such a way that this seems like a culmination of who they are, that it's that their personality, their experiences, the care that they feel for their companions, the care that they feel for the world, because it doesn't have to be just a personal sacrifice. It can be something that is for a group of people, a country, the world itself. But so it's making it seem like an extension of who they are. And you can also, so we've been talking mainly about people that were noble. Well, you can also have what I would return as the gap effect, that somebody that has been a villain, or somebody that has been an anti-hero, that this can be a redemptive sacrifice, that they can give of themselves as a way to give back, um, as a way to overwrite their past wrongs, mistakes, failures, etc. And so you can come at it from a number of approaches, but I would say it's an extension of whoever they were throughout the rest of the story. That you just have to make sure that the action is in line and believable.
Okay, so you touched on a couple of tropes there when you were talking about, the sacrifice on the last mission, that
Yes.
they finally have the dream and then they die.
Yes.
So, what other tropes do you usually avoid when you're crafting like someone sacrificing themselves?
There is the I just got married, or the I just started a relationship. I would say the other thing to avoid would be the exact opposite, that you feel like you have to have a death, that some people have a kill quota, that I have to have X many people die by the end of the book, or that there has to be a main character death in the climax of a story. A noble sacrifice doesn't have to just end in death. I know that that's the purpose of this show, but you can also end a book on a climax where somebody undergoes an abrupt change, or that they lose a piece of themselves, something that they enjoyed, a dream that they had, a goal or an aspiration, or that something they cherish deeply. Their family manor burns down, that their government or their country collapses. Something that they cared about deeply can also be a sacrifice. Something that they've given up in order to save their friends, or to well, sacrifices move the plot along, but me saying move the plot along, there's something else there. I'm just using that as filler space.
You
Yeah.
actually made a good point because, like you said, a sacrifice doesn't have to necessarily be the character dying. They could sacrifice a relationship, a
Hmm.
friendship, or even sacrifice someone else
Yes.
and they die, which would be an interesting plot point in
It would
itself.
be
And
an
I have
yes,
actually done that, but
interesting moral question, because is it noble at that point?
well, when I did it, it was kind of noble
Hmm.
because the person was
What
sacrificed
was
for
there
to
consent?
save the world.
It
Well,
comes back to the
there was
consent
kind of
question.
consent too. So yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
there was a prophecy involved and stuff too.
Hmm.
So but that is an interesting point. So you also touched on the unlikable or cowardly character being the sacrifice. Now, how do you turn someone's character around like that without it seeming like just a way to move the plot forward?
So this is actually what I'm primarily doing with my series. Not saying that they're going to die at the end or be sacrificed, but the main character in Divinity's Twilight is Valen Metellus. He starts out extremely unlikable. That he is this egotistical, arrogant person that believes he's the chosen one, isn't actually. But he's been having accolades and everything showered on him from a very early age because of his powers and abilities. It hasn't really had to work for anything. It's all come to him naturally, and he believes that he's entitled to his prestige and the way that the world views him. And so, a lot of my series is deconstructing this, breaking him down, and getting to him to a point where he's going to undergo evolution, change, that he's going to start seeing people as more than just peons, as things that support his existence. And so there are sacrifices that he makes along the way with doing that. But you also mentioned the cowardly character. Well, what are they sacrificing? Are they if they let's look at the quintessential cowardly character. You have Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit. Not necessarily a coward. There's moments where he's brave, but he does not want to go on the adventure at the beginning of The Hobbit. That this is anathema to him, that hobbits never go on these journeys, that this isn't something that's done. And he gradually comes out of his shell throughout the series. He sacrifices different things that he has for the dwarves, for his friends. That even going on the adventure itself is a sacrifice of the life that he's known, the comfort that he has. There's no guarantee. But I would say that especially with the cowardly character, it is a case of a single instance of bravery that you are building up throughout the story, that they have decided that this cause or whatever they're working to is more important than their own life, than their own safety, than their own comfort. And so you're breaking them out of that piece by piece, and you show this incrementally. You have a small sacrifices at first, them putting themselves in danger, and then you have more sacrifices, them training, them going on the adventure like we talked about, and you're building towards that ultimate sacrifice. And there's backsliding. There is, I'm afraid of this, but I'm doing it anyway. There is, I'm not sure of the outcome, but I'm going to try. And you show that at each point as you build towards the ultimate sacrifice. And at that point, they can even still be afraid. That oftentimes showing that humanity, showing that anxiety and trepidation is really important as you go into that moment. That I don't want to die. I don't want to lose whatever it is I'm going to lose, but I'm going to do it anyway for the sake of these things, that I have come to value X, Y, or Z more than I value myself and my safety. And again, it's the same thing with a villain. It's the same thing with anybody that doesn't fit your typical hero mold, that you are building up their character. It literally all comes back to characterization, as it does in many different things that we talk about writing wise.
So it's more of a personal motivation, would you say, for a character to like a deeply personal motivation to make the sacrifice?
I would say if it's done well, it almost always is a deeply personal. It can be grand. It can be that I care so much about the world and these people that I love that are in it that I'm going to sacrifice myself. It can be something as simple as I care deeply for this person, and so I'm going to jump in the way of the sword strike or whatever. There's a whole scale of things, but it all comes back to, it's more about the feeling of the character. How deeply do they feel that emotion, not the scale of the sacrifice.
When you're crafting a personal sacrifice, someone saving, say, one person, as opposed to someone saving the world, like with Frodo, or well, though he
Mhm.
didn't actually die, but um, so how do you go about doing those different scenarios, or are they different, or do they come from the same place?
I think that they come from the same place. It's more about in terms of structure. And so, for a very personal sacrifice, it is, have I done the legwork? Have I earned this sacrifice? And I'm sure other people that have talked to you about Words That Kill have talked about whether the scene, the pathos, the emotion of it has been earned. For a personal sacrifice, it's, did I build this relationship correctly? Do these people truly care about each other? Do I have very small scenes, them relaxing under a tree reading books together, them going fishing, the time that they were thieves together in a market, and that they saved each other, and that they were always there to rely on each other. It's a bunch of small interpersonal moments that build up. And it's the same journey for the save the world, but it's, why does this person care about the world? Why does it matter to them? What did the world do for them? Or you can do the opposite, that because they care so much about a few individual people, again, taking that personal and transferring it, maybe the world has been callous and cruel to them, but they care so much about this group of five individuals or something, that they are still willing to make that sacrifice for the greater world, that they extrapolate their care for these individuals for a care for humanity or whatever races that populate a world. And so I think it's the same journey. It's just how that you get there. What are you describing along the way? Are you still keeping it personal, or are you looking at the beauty of the world, that they love the mountain ranges in the distance and their snowy peaks, or the hubbub of the cities and the feeling of life around them? It's just dealing with whether you're dealing with macro or are we dealing with micro.
Okay, so when you sacrifice a character, what kind of immediate consequences do you usually deal with when on their loved ones and friends?
Well, so it's good that you mentioned this, that no sacrifice occurs in a void. That the very fact that we have relationships means that if you tug on any one strand or you remove an entire node, like killing a person, they get pulled out of their social web, that it tugs all those other strands with them. And so oftentimes when you kill somebody, it's less about what it means for them ceasing to exist, and more what it means for the people that are around them. How do they move on? How do they process the grief? And that's often what you're looking at and describing. And so I think it's very important to dig into that. That I have a number of sacrifices at the end of my book one, some very close and personal, some more distant, but and they relate to different characters. But throughout the whole first part of book one, some maybe 14 chapters or so, there's 4 parts in book two, but they're still dealing with the fallout of that, the grief. And so it's a lot of processing. There is a funeral. There are other people that come and talk to them, mentor figures that help them process this grief. There is someone that reacts very violently, very angrily, that they throw themselves into combat, throw themselves against impossible odds in order to process their grief, because that's the way that they've always done it, and that they're now dealing with multiple tragedies and associating the most recent tragedy with one that occurred very far back in their past. And there are a lot of different ways. We talk about the 5 stages of grief, and it's seeing where the characters fall on that spectrum. I have a very large cast. I have 8 cadets that form the main group, and all of them process these events differently. And so we get to explore the different ways that people deal with grief. Some people that process it well, that they've been soldiers throughout their lives, and this isn't something new to them, and so the funeral service, the being able to light a lantern, send it off down a river, and letting go of that name. They still keep the person with them, but that's enough for them. And then there, like I said, there's the person that reacts violently, that it takes out their grief on people around them. And then there are the people that come together, that weep, that cry, that share stories about the individual. And so you encounter all these different methodologies of processing death.
Okay, so how do you handle the long-term legacies of a sacrificial death, especially if it's been like a sacrifice to save the world? Because you're going to have in some instances, especially in fantasy, you're going to have legends
Yes.
crop up about the characters. You're going to have the government propaganda using the death as the way to help their causes. So how do you handle that?
So legacy is very important to Divinity's Twilight. I'd say it's actually foundational, because everything stems off of an event called the Battle of Harmuth. That there was 3 brothers, each of them had a different vision for peace in the world in Luzaria, and one of them was cast out by the other 2 for being too aggressive. That his methodologies of using force, of using military might to enforce peace, did not sit well with them, and he's eventually cornered with his army, and he turns to what's effectively dark magic, that he creates a vortex that is going to consume life and give him the power to recreate the world as he desires it. And so the other 2 brothers sacrifice themselves to stop this. That's literally the foundational event prologue of book one.
Okay, so you,
Mhm.
you mentioned you've never killed off a protagonist as a sacrifice, but would you consider that a series ender if you ever did do it in a book?
No, because if you're doing your story well, I'm trying to think of ways that I can look at this, examples I can give without spoiling anything. I don't think that there are any good ones, because they happen late in series, if the series does continue afterward. Well, there's Doctor Who. Most people know that Doctor Who has different doctors that come through in different stages, and they're picking up the legacy. And that's sort of how I would view it, that if you have established your secondary cast, if you have especially if you have a multi POV novel, where it's not just one person carrying the story, then it is more natural that you gradually give the others more screen time, that you foreshadow it, that perhaps there's talk of what would happen if the protagonist was no longer around, if they weren't there to lead the group, or they weren't there to be the heart and soul of the group. And that can be, again, it's whenever you use death, it's not about meeting a kill quota. It's not about just doing it for the sake. It's for a narrative purpose. And so if you kill a protagonist, what is the narrative purpose? Do you want the people that they trained to become the next generation of heroes? Do you want to look at what the world is like after they're gone? Is it necessary in order to drive home how bad your big bad is, to drive home what a threat their plan is to existence, or even much smaller stakes? You can bring it down to the personal level and go, well, if there's a gang war and the leader of the good gang gets wiped out, what does that mean for his followers? It doesn't have to be world-ending stakes, even though that's often the way that I view things.
Okay, so how do you handle reader reaction when you kill off a beloved character in a sacrificial way or in any way? Do you, especially with beta readers, do you take their feedback if they have an adverse reaction to it, or do you stick with your story?
I pretty much stick to my story. That uh, when books come out, I've heard from readers about the characters that they were really attached to and then died, and that they really disliked that, but that they kept reading. That talked to, I've had a couple beta readers talk about how that they wish people survive, or that the relationships they wanted to continue. There's a bunch of different ways to look at it, but I would say that it's more about, especially as an author, staying true to the story that you want. That if you get feedback that people don't want a character to die, you need to go back and look at, why are you killing that character in the first place? Um, is it to meet a kill quota? If so, toss it out the window, go rethink it. If it is to deal with grief, like we've talked about, which characters are it affecting? How does it affect their character arcs? Who do you want them to be on the other side of this death when they finish processing in whatever way that they do? Beta reader feedback is important. That they are people that are going to tell you how an actual reader is going to look at it, but then you have to take that information and then look at it from a writing craft standpoint.
So now we'll get into the last three questions, which are questions I ask everyone for fun purposes. So, do you have a favorite or most creative death that you've given a character?
Actually, this is book two. This was minor villain character, like a B villain, C villain, that is part of what drives the climax in book two. They die from magic compelled suicide.
Oh, that is
Yes.
interesting.
Yes. So one of the characters in my world, the climax of the book occurs in a zone that magic has essentially been blocked. That nobody can use their special powers, and everybody's just fighting with swords or guns or whatever that still works. And at the very end of this, after an airship crashes because the power, the mag tech that's holding it up, fails, and this guy gets pinned to the floor by a bunch of wreckage, has a pipe through him, and a character shows up that was supposed to arrest him. That the antagonistic side, I won't call them villains because nothing's that black and white in my world, but the antagonistic side has decided to arrest this guy for treason. That he was not supposed to take his forces and go fight this battle. But anyway, so she shows up, gets her power back in the middle of this conversation, and her power is that she's able to compel people with her voice. Typically with song, there's other facets to it that I haven't fully described for spoiler reasons. But she essentially tells this guy who he had a few of his men in the shadows that were getting ready to ambush her and kill her, but she tells him to kill himself essentially, and so he pulls out the pipe and bleeds out, and that's how he dies. But the other two people that were attempting to ambush him shoot each other. But there's a trigger warning for all this in the book, but that's probably the most creative or out there death sequence that I've had.
Okay, so what was the oddest or most interesting thing you had to research in order to make a character death?
I mean, the traditional one is, how much blood can you lose before before the body expires, before you can't live anymore. But everybody's done that. I have researched an extension of that, how much blood that it would take to fill up a few feet at the bottom of a specific size of space, like an Olympic swimming pool size. And I think Jeff Spite, we had a conversation where we both done that research. He's a Paladin Unbound.
Oh,
Um,
that's cool.
I've done how much based on how much insulation that a body has, how much heat it would take to kill a person. So a person in like wrapped in a bunch of steel plates, and then I there was some magical force involved, but see, and I ascribed like physical properties to the magical force to see how much heat it would take to fry a person inside of all that.
Okay, so do you have a favorite weapon or method of killing off a character?
If it is a hero, my favorite method, this comes back to writing perspective, is to be inside their head as the end happens, and that you get to write their final thoughts or what they're thinking, what they're afraid of or hopeful for, or things like that. And I'm sure this is true of most authors, that we prefer to be in the heads of the people, of our heroes that are passing, to get that final emotional moment, those final seconds that we'll have with them as authors, even before that we don't write them their perspective anymore. Before we have to write a sequel, a prequel, to go back and use their POV again. There's loss for readers, but there's also an emotional toll on authors as well, because these people are part of us. That they're either parts of our own personality, or parts of people that we've seen in the world, or a conglomeration of experiences that we've had, things that we care about, or even homages to other characters that we've loved and enjoyed. So I'd say that being able to give that, it's processing grief for us as well. So to be able to get those few final moments with them is my favorite methodology.
Cool.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you for being our guest today. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you
And
so much for having me on.
yeah, and be sure to check out Christopher Russell's books because they are wonderful, as his many, many readers have attested.
Yes.
So anyway, and be sure to join us for the next episode, Words That Kill. And that's all for now. Bye.
Back in elementary school, what always happened whenever the teacher left the room? The kids went crazy. Simple as it sounds, this is the basic premise behind Divinity's Twilight Rebirth. 700 years before the start of the novel, the good gods of the world, the Vanir, and the creator who made them vanished for parts unknown, leaving mortals to fend for themselves. In the midst of this chaos, 3 Terran brothers, essentially humans in the world of Lazaria, stood up along with their magical resource Illyriite, saying, "We have visions for peace, follow us." However, the power of the Illyriite soon corrupted the eldest brother, Sarkon, and he decided that he was going to subjugate the other races through the use of the sword, thereby bringing about peace, as he would be the only ruler making decisions. His 2 brothers, Darmatus and Raban, and many of the other leaders stood up against him and defeated him at the Battle of Harmuth. However, with his final breath, he used his Illyriite and another mythical resource called Elysium to open a cataclysmic vortex called the Oblivion Well, which was going to consume all life in the world and reset things to zero. Through the sacrifice of Darmatus and Raban, their Illyriite, and many of the other leaders, they were able to close the Oblivion Well and seal away this apocalyptic event. Flash forward 700 years to the present. Magtech has caused amazing advancements in the world. Airships now fly through the skies. Massive electrical generators provide power for thousands or millions of people in huge cities. You have great sporting events. You have amazing advances in medicine and magic. But the world is still in the midst of conflict. The 3 Terran states left by the brothers, Sarkonia, Dalmatia, and Raban, are still in the midst of a civil war. Nobody's come out on top, no one is dominant, and the other races aren't much better off. And what if, in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of this tense atmosphere, an ancient evil was to be resurrected? What if something that was buried away at Harmuth, that was sealed away, was to suddenly get free again? What would happen? And this is the environment that we start the thrilling fantasy epic Rebirth on. I hope you'll pick up a copy